as I said earlier, I believe victims expect that somehow, somewhere in the system, that offenders will be taught about the harm that they have caused. We have a justice system that's actually, I think, fairly good at doing what it's supposed to do. And depending on how you measure good, it's fairly good at identifying people who've broken a law and prosecuting them and punishing them. It makes mistakes. Innocent people are convicted. Guilty people are acquitted. But for the most part, the system gets those things right. Most part, guilty people who are charged are found guilty and then sentenced. You can argue with the sentence and what the crime was and all those things. But it does identify people who've done things that are illegal under the criminal code. And I think that there is an assumption, perhaps like some of the offenders that Kate thought, that once that that's done, that you've done that, then everything's okay. Certainly in the way we've designed victim services, governments seem to think that, because much of the services for victims sort of end when the system does, when the trial's over, when the conviction is there. There really isn't a whole lot for a lot of people after that. So, you know, I don't think it's just offenders who think that as well. I think if you look at the current political debate around victims' rights, it's really about the system. If the system convicts the right person and punishes him appropriately, then victims will be better for it. We've met their needs. There's really no evidence to suggest that's true. First of all, most victims don't report crimes, so the system's irrelevant to much of what they do. But I've worked with victims who have, in the cases where the system has worked. The police identified the person right away, even in cases like where the 3 young men were murdered, pled guilty right away. There wasn't a long drawn out trial. Was sent to prison for a very long time. The system worked. But the victims in those cases weren't left feeling any better than before. Shana Maroney, who I'm sure many of you know, wrote a book about her own experience called Through the Glass. She married an individual who was on parole. He had committed a murder when he was young and had been in prison for a while and was out on parole. All the experts said was a great candidate for success. She married him, and he, shortly into the marriage, ended up abducting 2 women and sexually assaulted them. And Shannon wrote in her book, which if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage, that at the end of the day, everybody went to court. The court convicted her then husband Jason, and then they sent the victims all home, as if somehow everything's better now. And I think victims have an expectation about justice. And I think one of the things I've learned over the years is that many victims think justice equals healing, or that justice is going to make it all better. And even in those cases where it's worked, the system's worked as well as it can, I've rarely heard victims talk about, I'm healed, I'm better. Maybe before the trial I couldn't sleep and I couldn't form relationships, I had PTSD, whatever the case may be. And now that the trial's over, I just feel better. I think that's an important element sometimes for some people in their healing journey, that there is closure to that, not so much what's happened, but that part's over, the system's over, that part, you don't have to worry about it anymore. But I've never heard anybody talk about being healed because someone's been sent to prison. I have heard people who've engaged with their offender, who've learned things about their offender, who've empathized with their offender. I've heard them talk about healing. And so I think that if victims understood, I think as they expect to happen, that those who go to prison for doing sometimes awful things were in there and learning about the impact of those awful things, that would bring some victims a little bit closer to healing, would help them on their own healing journey. And victims now have the right to receive information from Corrections Canada about the kinds of programs that offenders are taking. And I think for some, and I can't say for all, I think for some, if they were to look at that and say, victim impact program completed, that would be something for them. That doesn't mean they're going to buy them a puppy or go to the prison and welcome them and they're released. But I think it would be an important element of their journey hopefully towards more healing. And I think that many people who attend, I've been to parole hearings with, I don't know how many parole hearings I've been with to victims. And it's actually one of the things when victims are interested in doing parole hearings, I actually encourage them to do that. Because I think those types of hearings are actually far more beneficial for victims than trials. Right, in our justice system, most offenders don't testify. If they're convicted, their advice from their lawyer might be, don't say anything because we're going to appeal, or say something, from a victim's perspective, say something to the court about how bad you feel. But there's no explanation for why the person did what they did. There's no, from the victim's perspective, no questions they have are answered. There's nothing victims really gain from that process. But when you go to a parole hearing, and I'm sure many of you have been to parole hearings, the whole premise of it is that offenders are going to answer any question that the parole board asks them. Right? If you want to get parole, you're going to have to answer the questions the parole board asks. And contrary to a lot of perceptions, and one that I perhaps had many years ago, parole boards aren't just there to rubber stamp, certainly these days they're not, to rubber stamp the release of offenders and to, just ask them how they're feeling and stuff. Some of those parole hearings are incredibly long. Longest one I was at was 8 hours, and detailed. I mean, I've been to parole hearings where there was, and the one that I always tell my students about, where a woman was, a guy killed his partner with an axe because he claimed, and there was certainly a lot of evidence to support what he was saying, that she was suicidal and she begged him to do this, had begged him for days. But the parole board proceeded to ask him very detailed questions about, well, why'd you have an axe in your closet? You live in an apartment in the city, why'd you hit her that many? I mean, just very detailed kinds of questions. And he was forced to answer them. And you could, when you're there listening to someone talk about things they've done, and it's not, I was at Clifford Olson's parole hearings too, so that's a very different perspective. But for most offenders, whether they're ready for parole or they're a good risk, whatever, when they talk about those kinds of things, and victims see that and can often see how hard it is to talk about it and how hard it is to come to terms with some of those things, to come to terms with what you've done, and to admit it freely and be asked questions maybe no one's ever asked you before, that no one would ever ask you in a courtroom, even if you did testify. Victims gain information from that, but I think from my observations, and this is not research, it's all anecdotal, when victims see how hard offenders struggle with those things, and how difficult it is to admit those things, and how bad they feel about them, that does, for victims, give them a new perspective on perhaps the person that went into prison, and maybe at some point, whenever that is, the person coming out of prison. And to me, it all comes back to them seeing and understanding and empathy in the offender. They may not understand everything they go through. They may not understand everything that the victim's been through, experienced. But they do, I think, for the most cases I've been to, have some more appreciation of the harm they've done. And a lot of that comes from the victim impact statements. Because the parole board will often ask them, have you read it? What do you think about it? And when offenders can talk, just like when judges talk about it, when offenders can talk about those statements and maybe draw out certain things, where they can, I never realized that this would have happened. That display of empathy from victims' perspective. Often I've watched victims walk in with the weight of the world on their shoulders and walk out with that weight gone. They may or may not think the offender's ready for parole. They have different views on those things. But the fear and the anger is often diminished by just seeing that person and understanding that he does understand a little bit better about what he did and what the impact of it was. Again, that's not to be, certainly can't speak that for every victim, and I don't think every offender can display that or maybe has the ability sometimes to show that or to feel it. But when it does happen, it can have a tremendous impact on that person's life. So I think though, even though certainly I know different programs have victims come in and may have them speak to offenders, that can certainly help individual victims. I think telling their story despite what we might think, actually telling their story for some victims is healing, part of it. They feel they're contributing. They feel they're having an impact on offenders. That can be beneficial. But I think even in a more global way, I don't know too many victims who wouldn't support the notion of victim impact programs, and who frankly would be surprised, as your offenders maybe would be surprised that there aren't already those programs in every prison in this country. Because I think it's an expectation that victims have of the system that talks about accountability, at least to the offenders. Doesn't always show accountability to the victims. But part of accountability, I think, is making sure people understand the harm they've caused. And if that's something that really isn't done, I think that would surprise many people who've been through the system, who expect that would be part of the experience that one would have in a federal institution. I'm going to cut it there and look forward to any questions you might have when we do the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve.